the picture we have. The picture we have in the church on our history wall, they call it, is of a clapboard building. Now it could be this goes on and on. I just let it ring.
Yeah.
I'm
okay.
hoping that by letting it ring, it'll stop eventually. It's important they're going to leave a message anyway. So. This is the father and mother of my grandmother that lived next door in the red house.
Oh yeah. And because it took quite a while for exposures to catch.
That's their wedding picture.
Yeah.
He's a Hofmeister and she's the Hoyer.
Yeah. And of course, back then this is the style of dress, and
now
these expressions are probably more out of boredom than
actually. Well, yeah, because it stands still so long. It came over as M. Race, called from M. Race, but it's Walgreens. Telling me my prescriptions. One of my many prescriptions is ready.
And there was that house too you mentioned. I had posted on Facebook incorrectly as the St. Johnsburg School, but this was another building further back that was also next to the boulevard and also demolished pretty much at the same time as all the other buildings before the new school went up. That house on the boulevard I incorrectly...
Oh, the Bloom House.
Yeah, the Bloom House, yeah.
The Bloom House, yes. I still feel bad about that. Eugene was practically in tears because that house, that was a factory house. There must have been several factory buildings, so they must have settled here quite early. That house was in such good condition because it had been lived in continuously. The only problem was that little entry that must have been added on some years after the initial construction. You stepped out the door almost on the boulevard because the boulevard was so much narrower in 1844 and 1845. But that was a factory house. Krell's Inn was a factory building.
The Krell's Tavern, within that whole menagerie of additions, the central part of that was actually...
The high part of it was a factory building. It's the cat.
Oh.
She's very old.
Oh.
And down the street, there's a house on the east side, and it has a smallish barn behind it that's very well maintained. The house is very well maintained. It was, in my lifetime, there was a funeral home in there for a little while, but it didn't do much of anything because the local people here, when I was a kid, all used hemp and Tonawanda. Hemp was one of the first morticians around here. They had a big building, I think, across the street from where in Tonawanda. Well, actually, probably right where they are now, if you know where the Hemp Funeral Home is. Mm-hmm. There was a much older building, a high building there. They sold furniture on the first floor, I think, my people told me, and caskets on the second floor. And my grandmother remembered, she was born in 1902, so probably around 1908, when your first memories would be from. She remembered, now her grandfather was the one that Eugene always referred to as Karl the coffin maker. Karl Hofmeister. He made a lot of the schranks, the wardrobes, and all kinds of things. In fact, the one that's in the back part of Das house that has the an American Pie safe with the open lattice work.
No, yeah.
That Carl Hofmeister made that one, Eugene told me. And that was originally built into one of the factory houses. But they used to make all the coffins to size. And my grandmother remembered the house that I showed you, those two old ladies. One was my great great grandmother, and one was her sister with the gingerbread trim. This old man came to the door over there at that house, and he asked my great grandfather, who was Carl's son, to make him his coffin. And my great grandfather explained to him that they didn't do that anymore. That people use the morticians now. And because before that, my grandmother said her grandfather would make the coffin to size, and then the ladies would take it home and they would put you wouldn't even know this, but some of the old quilts have like almost a raw cotton that wouldn't have been spun into cloth or anything, and they would put that in the coffin, and then they would tack cloth in the coffin. They would do that themselves and then lay the person out in the coffin. This man around 1908, and finally he asked so many times that finally my great grandmother said, "All right, I will make your coffin for you." And that was probably the last handmade coffin, wooden coffin made in Wheatville, I would guess.
Wow. And that funeral home, that brief funeral home, that was on the boulevard?
No, Ward Road.
On Ward Road.
And my grandfather said to me that was, the old people called them mud houses. He said that building was a mud house. So I don't know the people that live there. One of these days, if I ever see anybody out, when I go past, I'm going to just stop and ask them if they know anything about the history of the house at all.
And I see that the building behind you, that house right there, was of course the roller skating rink. That was the Peppermint and Joe's.
It was the roller rink. That building goes back. The front part of that building. Well, now most of the back is gone. I got pictures of that too in the late 40s. I don't think
Me too.
You got them, all
yeah,
right.
I got those too.
Okay.
I mean, there was like one lady said it was a series of chicken coops,
well,
basically lashed together.
Yes, my dad said that even before him. Now he's 1924. He was born. The front part of it was built, and it was a feed store at one time, and it was a feed store and a saloon for a while and a grocery store for a while. It just went through morphed through a lot of things. And then Bill Stencil, that built the big house, he just kept adding on and made the roller rink out of it. So I don't really know what year. We probably could find that by looking through records. When it was called Uncle Bill's. My mother and father actually met at that roller rink because Dad lived right next door.
Oh, yeah.
Dad lived right next door, and she used to come down the street. She lived on Willow Avenue, which is just inside of North Tonawanda. It was an area when you go back in. I think it's the first street that goes to if you're going toward North Tonawanda, it's the first street that goes to the left. And they called that area Frogtown because it was low in places and swampy in places. And somehow, I got a little bit here on my mother's family. One of her cousins gave me these papers. I have lost and found these papers so many times. One of my mother's cousins, gave me these papers. And then died shortly thereafter. So it's just by luck that I had this little bit. Here it says, descendants of Frederica Goldbaum Kappen. So it's possible I have some Jewish ancestry here.
So do I.
Probably a lot of us do, because so many Jewish families converted. They made it look like they converted the first few generations. And I'm going back like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds
Hundreds of
of
more
years.
years, and with the effects of the Turkish invasions. And,
My old boss was a Holocaust survivor.
Hmm.
And there were quite a few other Holocaust survivors in Buffalo. And they used to come to visit him at the restaurant. And they'd be talking away in Yiddish, and they'd look at me and they'd say something. And especially if it had to do with figures and numbers, I would answer them in English. And they'd start to laugh. And I go, how the hell can you understand our Yiddish? And I said, well, Yiddish is a good part of Yiddish is a very, very, very old medieval German. I said, and then they threw some Polish in and some Hebrew in, and my boss looked at me and he said, you're exactly right. He said, but how can you understand this? I said, because my grandparents spoke this Plattdeutsch, we called it, which is an ancient German, an ancient form of German. I said, and a lot of the words you're using are those same words. I said, that's why I can pick up enough to know what you're talking about. Because Grandma and Grandpa next door, until they realized, I used to go next door sometimes with my father, and they always spoke Plattdeutsch in the house, Grandma and Grandpa. And my father, of course, back then was fluent in it too, and because he didn't know any English. When he went to school here at St. Johnsbury, he didn't know any English. He learned English at school because church was in High German and household and neighborhood was in Plattdeutsch. So, like my grandparents here knew 3 languages, where I know a little. I can understand a little Plattdeutsch, and I know a little enough High German to get by, but they were fluent in 3 languages.
You remember a lot about. Over the years, I've spoken to you about different things. You bring up your grandmother a lot about what her memories were. What are some of the standout memories that she brought up over the years about when she was growing up in Wheatfield, in the Burkholz area?
See, this is what people should be asking. And a lot of the interviews that have been done for Debrief, they're just asking it like you asked me about my life. I'm going to try to write all this stuff down now in a notebook.
Right.
Grandma remembered the man coming for the coffin, and like I say, that would be about 1908. She also then worked at the shredded wheat plant. When most of the people here, when they got out of 8th grade, they had to go to work. In fact, my grandfather next door here said to my father, when I was getting out of 8th grade, he said, well, does he have to go to high school? Can he go to work? And that was 1960, around 1962, 60.
And she worked in Henry Perky's factory then.
Right. And the shredded wheat plant.
Right, which became Nabisco Tech, as
yeah,
they called it.
I went to Nabisco Tech.
Yeah.
I had a math class. In the the old office building. I had history classes in the Parkway Inn that ran along there. My art classes, which was fantastic, on 3rd Street. It's hard to place where it is now because that whole area was demolished. But there was a great big old brick public school you know how the old classrooms, they have these huge classrooms, real high ceilings and great big windows. And that's where we had our studio art classes, like drawing and then unbeknownst to what they did is the first year, they were doing a pilot study for New York State for college courses. But we didn't know that. The students didn't know that. So it was about 40 of us in the art program, the fine arts program, the first year. And by the middle of that year, the end of the first, they had whittled it down. They told the students that they didn't think we're going to make it in the art part. They said to them, we're going to give you credit, but we would appreciate it if you jump into another curriculum, in which they did. So there were about 12 of us that actually got our associate's degree, LAFA degrees from Niagara NCCC. And then I transferred into Damon just as they were switching from Rosary Hill into Damon. In fact, the guys that were there then that was originally like a girls' school, and Andy and I took we actually had applied to Buff State, but a couple of other students had gone to Buff State too, and Andy Durkin and I got ours in a little too late. They accepted us for the spring semester, but we would have to skip a semester. Well, it was during the Vietnam War, and anybody that was in school wanted to stay in school. Well, it turned out I got called down for my physical anyway, and I couldn't see without glasses. I couldn't see enough. I had high blood pressure. I was already taking medications, and they just said, "No, we don't want you." So I wouldn't have had to. I could have waited for that spring semester, but
and when people were in college, then there were stories of the occasional teacher going, "Look, I'm going to give you all good grades. I don't care how good or bad you are in class. I'm going to give you all good grades so that you don't end up getting, deported, like removed from the school system, and therefore get susceptible to the draft." Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are the times. And your grandmother then, after working at the shredded wheat factory, is that where she spent a lot of her early career? And what else did she encounter around the time? Did she come back home to live here, right? Did she go back and forth?
What she did was she roomed in Niagara Falls during the week, and then I got a picture here.
You probably come back here on the weekends, right?
Well, that's another memory of hers. She would take the trolley up from Niagara Falls, up Whitmer Road, and then up River Road, and her father would meet her with a horse and wagon, coming from right across the street here, go down Whitmer Road to where the train was at River Road and Whitmer Road, and pick her up and bring her home for the weekend. And then she'd spend the weekend, and then she'd go back someplace. Here, here's a picture of her.
Wow.
That's a picture of her dressed in her. They had to wear, white uniforms, and that one, white uniforms and little caps, and everything had to be very sanitary. And then also a lot of the farmers around here, all what would fall to the floor, all the little schnibbles, I'll use the German word, of the shredded wheat. You know what a shredded wheat cake is like, a biscuit. Yeah. There would be piles of it on the floor, and they would collect all that, put it in sacks, and the farmers around here would all go buy that because the pigs loved to eat it. So nothing went to waste. The wheat from here probably got made into shredded wheat, and then all those little pieces got used for pig food. Of course, the pigs would eat anything.
Anything, anyways. But you recalled her too. I think it was either she recalled or you recalled somebody else saying that in that aforementioned house on the boulevard there, not the St. John's School, but the one, again, I'm mistaken for the school, that there was a kind of smokehouse built into the upper,
there were, some of the Foxbrook houses around here it's called a black closet in English. Mm-hmm. Schwartz, what would it be in German? Schwarzschrank, maybe. Schwartz is black and Schrank would be covered. But it was built right into the chimney, so that a fancy house like that would have had a cook stove in the kitchen. I mean, Grandma had a cook stove. She had an electric stove and a cook stove in her kitchen most of the time she lived here, until the last couple of years, and she preferred using the cook stove, which burned coal and or wood. And then they had the parlor stove they had here somehow got sold to when Marcia Kruger from Kruger Road, when she was married to Don McSwan, our supervisor, for a while. Mm-hmm. We all went to, Marcia and I went to school from first grade to graduating high school together. But Don we went to high school together. But anyway, they had a real fancy
yeah.
parlor stove next door with isinglass, mica windows all in it, a real fancy one. And that's what they heated. The cook stove heated the one part of the house, and that parlor stove, you call it, heated the living room, dining room part of it. And then the heat, there were registers. Most of the old houses around here had like an open register in the ceiling and the floor, like a grate, and your heat went up to heat the rooms up, give a little heat to the rooms upstairs.
And so there's a radiated heat.
This house actually is so old that in the high part of it, in the corner, the front corner, coming this way, there was an extra door, and that was Schroeder Taylor's house, his workroom. Schroeder means tailor in German. Schroeder is cutting, so it was Schroeder Krall's house, and he had just like the Hoffmeister. There was a Hoffmeister that was the coffin maker. His house, it was a fachwerk house that also is gone now, on Niagara Road, just past the viaduct, going toward Niagara Falls, on the north side. I think there's still a silo there, and there's a whole big clump of trees where the house was.
Right off of.
But
right
most
off of what street again?
on Niagara Road.
You're right over there. I was just
Most
there.
of the most of the old houses where there was a craftsman as opposed to just a farmer, they had that house also had an extra door in the front and his workroom there. Here's another memory from Grandma. She said when she was this grandma, she said when she was a little girl, and the cousins would be over there at their grandfather's house, he never wanted them to play in the workroom because he didn't want them to cut themselves on saws and draw knives and all the woodworking tools that he used. So he used to chase them out of the workroom all the time. And she also remembered walking behind his coffin when he died, and they took him from, it would have been the old St. James Church, to the St. James Cemetery, which wasn't too far, but that's how they did it in the old days. They carried the coffin, and I think she said the coffin was actually on a wagon, a horse wagon, and that all the people walked behind. So that's one of the oldest memories I can bring up from her.
When things were done locally,
everything was done locally. Yeah.
And there were a number of other shops along here too, like Shoemeister?
Well, Shoemeister's was here. Probably now my great grandfather around the corner there at the White House, but the building that was in front of it, they closed that store between the time he died and the time she died. So probably around 1917 or just pre probably World War I. I don't know how long that store went, but I know that my dad said that the icebox, there was a great big, in fact I got to ask one of the firemen, because the St. Johnsburg Fire Company, if you go in the back door, there's at the very end, there's a great big old-fashioned, what would have been an icebox cooler with lots of doors and glass doors. And
the old station.
And they had one of them in this, but it had been electrified. Well, no, it's in the new station.
Oh, it's in the new section, I'm sorry. Yeah.
They may have moved it out of the old station, or it might be the one out of the Shoemeisters. I don't know, because I'm not sure how long when that store started, or whether the Shoemeisters. We probably could try to do some old town records on that building. Now here's a story too. My grandfather, this grandfather, told me that the back part of that building, probably as it stands today, now it has been remodeled quite a bit, was rolled all the way from Mavis Drive over there, was rolled on long rollers all through the fields and connected onto that building. He said they did that a lot. That's how this house was moved back to where it is now. It was rolled.
On the
I think you have those pictures
Yeah,
that
was
of them digging out the solid hole.
the digging solid hole for this house, and then what was rolled across the fields
That was
for Mavis.
added on to the Schumeister building.
Schumeister building,
Yeah.
to improve that.
You could see.
Building.
I'm curious now as to who owned that. You probably don't have those kind of records that have to be done in like a search in Lockport.
Yeah, probably.
Who owned that before the Schumeister?
I think if it was before the 50s, yeah, it would have to be on county or on the
my
maps.
father always remembered it being the Schumeister store. Here's another memory of during the Depression, because at least they said they didn't have any money, and they might have not had, Grandma and Grandpa might have not had any money. Grandma actually took a basket, like there's one sitting out there, we call it a market basket. There's one sitting out there, and she put quite a few eggs in it and butter that she had made, walked across the street to Schumeister's store, and traded those eggs and butter, which Mrs. Schumeister could sell in the store, traded them for a couple of little trucks for my dad and his brother so that they could get a toy during the Depression.
Oh, wow.
Because my grandfather had gotten laid off, and he worked for his uncle, Uncle Ed, who was Aunt Louise's husband from the Griner house, or the Eric house. He worked for him for 50 cents an hour whenever Uncle Ed had enough. It was his Uncle Ed, his father's brother. Whenever he had enough work, he would pay my grandfather 50 cents an hour to work on the farm over there.
Because it was still work. It was
It
still
was
work.
still work, and it brought in a little bit of cash. But these people, most of these people, like I said, I started to say that before, this was a 15-acre farm. And these small farms were everywhere. And even in my grandfather's generation, like he was a machinist for Alan Herschel. My father then was a welder for Alan Herschel. And first when he worked there, it was like they called it the ball gang. You did whatever needed to be done. They would put all the rides together. Even when I was a little kid, yeah, they would put all the kiddie rides together there that they made and test them out, and then they'd pack them up and send them off on the train. But most of these people around here, like all the barns I'm talking about going up White Road, most of the people had a cow or two, chickens. Now, when I was a kid, Grandma and Grandpa had 2 cows, 1 horse. The horse was kept in the old barn on Church Road. And the 2 cows were over here. And that small, long building, there's the garage that's almost falling down over here. And then the next building, before you get to the big barn, that building is real old. That must be current with the house because there's no ridgepole. John has actually put 2x4s along there. The roof beams are saplings with bark still on one side and shaved off flat. So I tried to, Doris was so,
Oh, wow.
Doris Carlson, I think you know the Carlsons.
Yeah.
She originally was in love with, or she still is in love with, a big barn, which thank God they just had roofed. But I told her, Doris, your smaller building, the building my grandmother called the Red Shed, I said, that's an old German barn, because the old people here, the big barn actually is 1886 or 1887.
Mm-hmm.
But that smaller building would predate that big barn, because if you go in and look at it, it is really, really old. And in fact, because it's partly divided too, I'm wondering if maybe they built that first and lived in the one end of it, because just like Einhaus, people lived in the same buildings with their animals. But that's a really old barn, that small building. I hope they take care of that.
It feels like it might be from the 1840s, or maybe...
Probably not that old. We would have to try to go... I thought Elaine had a search because of her family having owned that. There's a couple different Kroll families, and they don't seem to be related. Now, probably if you go back to Europe and go back another 3 or 4 generations. They probably are. You know, it's like I'm 6 cousins to probably 800 people in Wheatfield and Lewiston.
Oh boy. And you said that there was like another shop down the way from Shoemeister's here too.
Well,
that you described like outbuildings, like ice houses or.
Well, Shoemeister's.
Shoemeister's.
You can still see the foundation of the ice house there, and there was a fairly big barn, but a smaller, like a German type barn, behind the building, behind Shoemeister's. Behind the building as it stands now. I think the foundation of the ice house is still there. And then there was quite a long barn, and then there was another small building, and then when I was a kid, really young, there was like like it would look kind of like a weathered 2-car garage closer to the street. And my father said that had been a blacksmith shop. So there were quite a few buildings there. And then the Kroll, where the Kroll building was, then there was a yard behind that, and then there was a driveway that in my day went back behind the old town hall and fire hall. And then on this side, coming this way of that driveway, there was another ice house and kind of a garage, 2 really, really, really old buildings. And then the old town garage still stands there behind the old town hall and the old fire hall,
which became a salon and the music store, respectfully later on.
Yeah,
way later on.
Yeah, I registered to vote in that town hall, and the ladies were they wouldn't let me register as a independent, so they were horrified when I registered as a liberal. Just horrified. They gotcha. They were shaking. I mean, it was just unheard of for anybody in Wheatfield to be a Democrat or a liberal.
And your supervisor Brzezinski, when he was around, he said later on that they were so cramped and so forth in there eventually that people in town board meetings, the public used to have to go past them to use the restrooms in there. Because there was no restrooms until even in the building until later on.
There were no there. Now the Johnsburg School, when I went there was. I'll have to find a good picture of that to show you. That they had built a little front on it with and then quite a large entryway where you went inside the doors and then went up some steps to the main level. And then there was a boys' restroom on one side and a girls' restroom on the other side. But when my father went there, they only had outhouses. In fact, the White House, built around that still stands there, my great-grandmother built that around 1920, no bathroom, privy. And the neighborhood considered it fancy because there was a hand pump at the kitchen sink that pumps water up from the cistern in the basement. Because even in my youth, we had no city water here.
Right.
You went to there was a pump, just like the pump that's in front of John and Doris's. There was that well was not good for the animals, but too close to the road for humans. But the pump at the parsonage, most of the neighborhood went there and pumped it. We had a water bucket set right in the cupboard with that paper towel holder is, with a dipper, which I still have somewhere.